I'm a 32-year-old guy, and I've been raising my 5-year-old son on my own. It's just the two of us in a small apartment, and I have a full-time job that's anything but easy. My mom, a 60-year-old woman, thinks she knows best when it comes to parenting, and she's never shy about sharing her opinions. To her, my laid-back approach isn't the right way to raise a kid. I remember growing up in a house where everything had rules. No staying up past 8 p.m., no talking back, and definitely no crying over spilled milk. If I did, well, you get the idea. It didn't end well, but I promised myself I'd be different when I had a kid. I want my son to feel like he can tell me anything, express how he feels, and just be himself. Honestly, I think I'm doing okay. My son is happy, kind, and learning how to deal with his emotions, but my mom doesn't see it that way. It all started getting worse a few months ago. We were at my mom's place for dinner, just a normal family gathering. My son, being the energetic little guy he is, spilled a glass of water. It wasn't the end of the world, right? But my mom jumped in, scolding him for not being careful and saying he needed to learn discipline. I told her to take it easy, that he's just a kid and accidents happen, but she kept on saying I was too soft on him, letting him act however he wants. The whole room went quiet, and it was clear that things were getting tense. My son looked at me, confused, not sure why Grandma was upset. After that dinner, my mom started pushing for what she called structure. She'd bring it up almost every time we spoke. According to her, my son needed a strict bedtime of 7 p.m., no exceptions, because kids need discipline. She wanted his mealtime set in stone, no screen time whatsoever, and a bunch of other rules. I listened the first few times, but eventually, I had to tell her that I was raising him my way. I didn't want to hear her parenting advice anymore. She waved it off like I was just being ungrateful. Things took a turn when she started showing up at my son's daycare. I found out when one of the staff mentioned that Grandma had dropped by to chat. She'd been talking to them about how my son needed more discipline and suggested they be stricter with him. No one at the daycare followed her advice, thankfully, but the fact that she went behind my back like that, it wasn't cool. When I confronted her about it, she acted like she was just looking out for us, saying that with all her experience, she knew what was best for her grandson. She didn't stop there, though. It's like she couldn't help herself. She'd tell my son things like, "Back when your dad was little, he wouldn't dare act like that," or, "When I was raising your father, we did things differently." It was like she was constantly trying to remind both him and me that she knew better. I had to step in, telling her that those comments weren't helping anyone, but she just brushed me off again. I tried to explain to her that I had been working with a child therapist to help my son learn to express his emotions. I thought it would help her see that I wasn't just making things up as I went, but she called it coddling and said that back in her day, kids didn't need therapy, they just needed discipline. I could see she wasn't going to change her mind. Then there was the time she bought him a bunch of clothes and toys. At first, it seemed like a nice gesture, but everything she picked out was stuff that fit her style, way more conservative than what I usually get him. It was small, but it felt like another way of trying to push her preferences onto him. And then there was the money. She always found a way to bring up how much she helped me out when my son was born. Back then, I wasn't making much, and she helped us get through some tough times. I've always been grateful for that, but lately, she's been using it like leverage. It's like she thinks that because she helped us out financially, she gets to have a say in how I raise my son. The rest of the family got involved, too. My aunts, uncles, and cousins all had their 2 cents. Some of them sided with my mom, saying I should be more appreciative of the help she's given and let her be more involved. Others thought I was doing the right thing by standing my ground. It turned into this whole family drama, and suddenly, everyone had an opinion about how I should raise my kid. The worst part was at this one family gathering. My mom, in front of everyone, started criticizing how I was raising my son, talking about how he needed more discipline and structure. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, and I just wanted to disappear. My son was playing in the other room, but I could tell he sensed the tension. That night, I made up my mind. I started cutting back on how much time my mom spent with my son, trying to put some space between them. Of course, that just led to more passive-aggressive comments from her. She'd drop by unannounced with gifts, or she'd text me about how sad she was that she didn't get to see her grandson as much. Eventually, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. I went online, found a subreddit where people talk about family drama, and I laid it all out there. I asked if I was wrong for wanting to raise my son the way I thought was best and for setting boundaries with my mom. Honestly, I didn't expect much from it, but the responses I got blew me away, and that's where everything really started to change. He shouldn't be watching cartoons so close to bedtime, or, he's too old to still be using that baby talk, don't you think? It felt like my mom was always finding new ways to insert her opinion into how I was raising my son, even though I had made it clear that I didn't want that. My son started getting confused. One day, he asked me why Grandma said he wasn't allowed to watch his favorite show before bed when I had said it was okay as long as he finished his dinner first. Another time, he got upset because Grandma told him he should only eat healthy snacks, but I had let him have a small treat after finishing his vegetables. These were small things, but they started to affect him. He didn't understand why Grandma and Daddy had different rules. I brought this up during one of his therapy sessions, and the therapist told me I needed to keep things consistent for him. She said that if my mom kept undermining me, it would make it harder for my son to understand what's right and wrong. I knew I had to draw a firmer line, but things only got messier. My mom showed up one day with a serious face, saying we needed to talk. She laid out an ultimatum. Either I accept her way of doing things and let her be more involved, or she'd stop helping us out financially altogether. She framed it like she was trying to help me see sense, but all I saw was her trying to control the situation. I told her I appreciated everything she'd done for us, but I wouldn't compromise on how I was raising my son, even if it meant tightening my belt and figuring things out without her help. That conversation didn't end well. She left, slamming the door behind her, and I didn't hear from her for days. A week passed, then another. She stopped calling, didn't answer my texts, and skipped her usual Saturday visit with my son. I realized she was giving me the silent treatment, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I felt relieved or just more stressed out. The silence didn't last long. Soon, I started getting calls from aunts and uncles, telling me I was being disrespectful to my mom. They kept saying I should apologize, that I was being stubborn, and that family was more important than any disagreement. One aunt even suggested that I was turning my son against his grandma, which wasn't true at all. All I wanted was for us to have some space and for her to respect my parenting choices. Meanwhile, I had to adjust to the financial impact of my mom's ultimatum. I cut back on anything extra, no takeout, no little treats for myself. I even started looking into taking a second job to make ends meet. It was tough, but I managed. Even though things were tighter than ever, I noticed something small but meaningful. My son seemed calmer. He wasn't confused about the rules anymore, and he started opening up more during our therapy sessions. The therapist pointed out that this progress was a sign that consistency was paying off. But with progress came a sense of loneliness. I didn't miss the arguments, but I missed my mom being around, especially when my son would ask why Grandma wasn't visiting. He didn't understand the bigger picture, and I didn't know how to explain it to him. I started wondering if I had done the right thing by pushing her away, or if I should have found a different way to handle things. Feeling stuck, I turned back to Reddit. I shared everything that had happened since my first post and asked for advice again. People rallied behind me, offering words of encouragement and even suggesting ways to budget better now that I couldn't rely on my mom's help. Some even shared tips on how to explain things to my son in a way he could understand. The support made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely out of my depth, even if I still had a lot of doubts. One thing was clear, though, I couldn't go back to how things were before. I didn't know what the future held with my mom, but I knew I had to keep standing my ground for my son's sake. And maybe, just maybe, things would work out in the end, even if I couldn't see how yet. Update 2. A few weeks after my last update, things took a sharp turn. My son had a minor accident at school. He fell during recess and hit his head. The school nurse called me immediately, letting me know they were taking him to the hospital just to be safe. I dropped everything at work and rushed over. When I arrived, my mom was already there. I don't know how she found out so quickly, but she looked panicked. She had somehow gotten into the emergency room and was talking to the doctors. When I walked in, she was grilling them about the care they were giving my son, questioning if they had run the right tests. She kept pointing out that when I was a kid, things were done differently, like she knew better than the professionals. It turned into a scene. The doctor tried to assure her that everything was under control, but she kept pushing. I could see the nurses shooting each other looks. Meanwhile, my son, lying on the bed with a small bandage on his forehead, looked between us, confused and a little scared. I stepped in, telling the doctor that I'd handle things from here and asking my mom to step out with me. She didn't take it well, saying she was just worried about her grandson and that I wasn't doing enough to make sure he got the best care. But I insisted, and eventually, she left the room, though I could hear her muttering under her breath as she walked out. Once we were in the hallway, she started tearing up. She accused me of keeping her out of important moments, of driving a wedge between her and her grandson. She kept bringing up everything she had done for us, acting like I owed her more involvement in my son's life. I had reached my breaking point, right there in the hospital corridor. I told her why I needed things to change. I told her about my childhood, how her strictness had made me feel like I could never do anything right, how I had always felt like I was walking on eggshells around her. I explained that I didn't want my son to feel that way. I needed him to know that it's okay to make mistakes, that he doesn't have to be perfect. My mom listened, but when I finished, she brushed it off, saying she had raised me the only way she knew how. She said that any issues I had with my childhood were my own to deal with, not hers. She insisted she was only doing what was best for me back then, and now she was doing what was best for her grandson. I told her that I respected that she had her way of parenting, but I had mine. I wasn't asking for her permission. I was setting the terms for how things would be moving forward. My son was my responsibility, and I needed her to respect that. I could see the hurt in her eyes, but I held my ground. After that, she started withdrawing even more. She stopped showing up at events, didn't ask to see my son, and when I reached out, she kept things short. Through the grapevine, I heard she was telling people that I had shut her out, that I didn't appreciate everything she had done for us. It felt like she was playing the victim, but I tried to ignore the noise and focus on my son. At the same time, I started worrying about what might happen if she tried to take things further. I had heard stories of grandparents getting legal rights to visit their grandkids, and while I didn't think my mom would actually go that far, I wanted to be sure. So, I consulted a lawyer just to understand my options. It was a tough conversation, and the lawyer advised that if I wanted to formalize things, I could, but it might make the family situation even more tense. Meanwhile, my son was thriving without the back-and-forth confusion. He was more relaxed, doing better in school, and making friends more easily. His therapist noticed a big improvement too, mentioning how much more confident he seemed when talking about his feelings. It was one of the few bright spots during a time when everything else felt like a struggle. But money was still tight. With my mom cutting off the extra help, I was stretching every dollar. I picked up extra shifts when I could, and there were days when I barely got to see my son awake. It wasn't easy, but we were managing, and that's what mattered most. Then, out of the blue, my mom reached out. She sent me a text asking if we could meet somewhere neutral, like a park, because she wanted to understand my perspective. I almost didn't believe it, but I figured it couldn't hurt to hear her out. Reddit had been a huge help through everything, so I posted a quick update, and people encouraged me to stay cautious but also to see if maybe this could be a chance for real change. We met up at a park a few days later. My mom looked nervous, and for a while, neither of us really knew what to say. Then she started asking about some of the things I had been doing with my son, like therapy and the new routines I had set up. She didn't criticize, which surprised me. She seemed genuinely curious, even asking if there were books or resources she could read to understand the new methods better. I kept the conversation focused on what my son needed, explaining why I had chosen this approach and how much progress he had made. For once, she listened without jumping in to disagree. It wasn't like she suddenly turned into a different person, but there were moments where I thought maybe, just maybe, she was trying to see things from my perspective. We didn't solve everything that day, but we ended on a hopeful note. She agreed to think about how she could be involved in a way that respected my boundaries, and I told her I was open to finding a middle ground. As I watched her walk back to her car, I couldn't help but wonder if this might finally be the start of something better. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than I had expected when I first made that post. Maybe there's hope after all. Thank you very much for watching to the story so far. I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss tomorrow's stories.